Hi everyone, and welcome to the week 4 wrap up for our eGrad module, Research Integrity in Practice. So on to week 4, and thank you to everybody who contributed to the discussions this week. Your insights are always really valuable and I enjoy reading them. Hopefully next week we can have a few more people participate in the discussions because it is our last week. So let's get on to our wrap up for today. So we focused on respect this week, which of course is a foundational principle in research integrity. It underpins all the principles that we've been looking at so far through the course. And I think what's great about this week is our attention is turned to the environment and to animals as research participants. And once again, we've also been looking at the importance of recognising the values and beliefs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as well. So we will look at the discussion shortly and I'll share my screen, but just in the meantime, I want to quickly look at a few of the really interesting things that were in the materials this week. And, you know, with the principle of respect, whether we're talking about our research in general or talking about life, respect works both ways, doesn't it? Where we gain respect by giving respect as well, and by acknowledging the needs of others and treating each other in a fair way, which of course links to our week 3 materials from last week. So not only was it that the human participants, of course, that we need to consider when we're doing our research, but we saw the importance of animals and the environment and also communities, which we, of course, have talked about before, in particular when we had Marie Perry talking about our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, but also any community that was potentially going to be affected by our research. Of course, we need to respect everyone. So principle 5 of the Australian Code, that was what we were focusing on today, where the research participants and respect for them, the wider community, and as we said, animals and the environment. So of course, there's a whole lot of policies and procedures around respect that we need to comply with. There's a lot of information there. And as we saw in the discussion scenarios that, you know, there's often a lot of aspects that we need to consider before we even can do any research at all. So a big responsibility for us as researchers, of course, our ethics committees, if we're at university too. And as we saw with so many different moving parts when we are thinking about research integrity, that's probably why sometimes our research ethics does take a long time to get through. So in terms of human ethics, we focus this week on the importance of making sure whatever we're asking our human participants to do, that we're honest, that we're transparent, and that respect underpins everything that we're doing. So I think a really important way we can keep this at the forefront of our mind is the idea of doing no harm and making sure that we do everything we can to make sure all of our participants are respected throughout the whole research process. And even at the end, once we've got our conclusions and the project has completed, to making sure that the way we disseminate our research findings is respectful to our participants as well. I think an interesting thing, but hopefully you did look at the Researching Right Way document from 2013. I found that has a real lot of interesting things looking at other research contexts, not just at Australia. I just want to quickly focus on the New Zealand conclusions from that document, where their guidelines were quite practical, maybe less philosophical than other countries. They gave really concrete steps and instructions for conducting research with Maori people, and there's less room for interpretation. That was one of their conclusions there for the New Zealand codes. where when comparing to the Australian guidelines, which I thought was really interesting as well. However, as I said, this was 2013, and we would have noticed that the Indigenous Australian code has been updated as recently as 2020. The Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research, we saw that really great figure with integrity in the middle of the figure, and then all the different parts and the responsibilities that researchers have whenever they're involving Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in their research. So potentially, you know, these updates have made, given us more practical guidelines like they already have in New Zealand. And the New Zealand ethical codes also have a strong focus on consulting and engaging the Maori people, which we know, of course, from Marie's really great presentation and everything we've been learning in the materials, that's something that in Australia we've been focusing a lot on recently, the idea of consulting the community and making sure that their values and beliefs are respected the whole way through. The effect on the environment was a really interesting focus that we had as well. A lot of us as researchers, we may not need to include those aspects in our ethical considerations. So focusing, for example, on hazardous materials if we're working in a lab, or if we're out in the field, respecting habitats, waterways, flora and fauna, which we see and we'll discuss in a minute for discussion 3. And then, of course, with the aspect of using animals, I think that one is a really interesting code that is quite complex as well, with a lot of things to be thinking about for any researchers, whether they're using animals in a lab potentially, or as we saw in discussion 2, out in their natural habitat as well. I think a really interesting aspect of that, the Australian Code for the Care and Use of Animals for Scientific Purposes, is where they state that in the first instance, researchers should find a way where they can do the research without even using the animals. So find another way to undertake that research. I think that's very, very interesting. And if you do need to use the animals, for example, in our scenario 2, of course, I'm not sure how that researcher would be able to do her research without actually touching and tracking the animals. Maybe she could find a way, but as I say, with the second instance, if you do have to use the animals, try to use as few as possible. So I think both of those aspects regarding the animals and the environment are really interesting, particularly for us who have focused our research on human participants mainly. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. All right, so while we are looking at these scenarios, let's have a quick look. Marta, an international student, looking at marsupials in their natural environment and the effects of employing local Indigenous rangers to help maintain that habitat. So as we said, the Code for Scientific Research on Animals is saying in the first instance, try not to even have the animals as your participants. So we can see in this scenario that Marta is thinking that she is going to watch them. So I think that is going to be fine, as long as she's very careful, of course, of the habitat, and then also the Indigenous community as well, whose lands it would be. And also it would be potentially a national park. So you have the government wanting to make sure that everything's left alone and as it was before she entered into that area. But she is also talking about tagging the animals as well. So that's something that she would really need to consider whether, you know, does that have to go ahead? Is watching them going to be enough? But potentially at least tagging them, she can track them much more, obviously, and the time that she needs would be reduced for her to be actually out in the field. So thank you again to everybody in the discussion thread. We had some really good points there. And obviously, as everybody said, she has the wider community, the animals, the environment, the Indigenous ranges as well. So a lot for her to focus on and to respect in every step of her study. All right, let's move on to activity 3, the scenario 3. So this one was really interesting as well. Again, we are in the environment, there's flora and fauna involved, and also the wider community. So again, respect for the wider community comes into this, and, you know, potentially these researchers, they're in a city, of course, and so there's going to be people walking and doing their everyday lives around potentially the research site. So that's something they want to have as little disruption as possible, of course. And as the people in our discussion thread discussed, you know, there's the respect is also in terms of the research team. And we've looked at that before as well. You know, when you're the only researcher, that you're not really having to consider as such other people as part of a team. But when you're in a team, everybody has their own goals, they bring their own skills that they have. And so the responsibilities that each person takes on as part of that research team really needs to be negotiated in a fair and respectful way. So in this case, the 2 students, they obviously want to complete everything that they need to complete their degree. So Robin and Suresh have to make sure that they have those opportunities to do everything they need to do to cover for their degree. And then, of course, I think it was Hamish that raised a really good point that even though the students were the ones doing the field work mainly, it was really important that Suresh and Robin, as the senior investigators, make sure that they're there for them when they need, and that they're there to guide and also to, at times, come and give them a hand and be part of that process as well. So I think, as I said, both of those scenarios are very interesting for us to consider. And, you know, I think they raised a whole lot of really good points for us. All right, I'll just quickly stop sharing. All right, so I trust that by examining this week's materials and thinking about these scenarios, you've been able to achieve those learning objectives for week 4, in particular being able to identify and learn those key characteristics of respect in all aspects of your research projects, the ones you're doing now and the ones in the future, of course, and how those characteristics might be applied in practice. And also being able to identify all those different parts of your research projects and future projects where respect is going to be, you know, come in all different ways, you know, depending on your participants, depending, of course, on where your research is being undertaken, and looking at the wider community and the environment, and potentially if you are investigating animals as well. So once again, like in our previous weeks, the module materials, they're really consolidating for us the importance of research integrity in all parts of our research from the very beginning when we're designing and even thinking about our aims and objectives. And they've also really been helping us to understand that we have a lot of responsibilities as researchers, which potentially not everybody thinks about initially when they're developing their research plans, but we're beginning to really have a very good idea that research integrity is one of the most important things we can think of as researchers, and from the very beginning to the very end as well. So looking forward to seeing you guys for week 5, our final week of the module. And as I said, I hope everybody can take part in those discussion threads next week. So I hope you have a lovely weekend, and I'll talk to you next week.